Hello? Oh, I'm on. And I'm echoing. Okay, are our colleagues online? Have they been put up? So is Helena and Antonio with us? Okay. Great. Hi, everyone.
Hello,
You can
hi,
respond.
sorry.
It's a physical conference. Hello, everyone. You all doing good? So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to host this panel at this incredible and important event, and probably the first physical event and conference that I've been at, and really honored to actually moderate this discussion with some very incredible panelists that you get the pleasure of hearing from today. And hopefully online we'll be joined by Helena and Antonio as well to offer some rich insights into the European higher education area. So just before I hand over to our phenomenal speakers, wanted to give you guys maybe a little crash course and understanding on what we're going to be discussing and what and where the concept of the European higher education area came from. Any of you familiar with the Bologna process? Vaguely, some, great. It's a great place to start because I could say a couple of years ago I had no idea. But the Bologna process is a mechanism promoting intergovernmental cooperation between 48 countries in the field of higher education. The Bologna process seeks to bring together higher education systems across Europe. And it was and that's what established the European higher education area to facilitate student and staff mobility, to make higher education more inclusive and more accessible, and to make higher education in Europe more attractive and competitive worldwide. And since then, there's been much progress in reforming higher education systems of the EU member states and beyond. And that's and there's many things from learning and teaching, degree qualifications, quality assurance recognition, internationalization and mobility, employability, and of course, access and participation have played pivotal roles in some of the work that they've been working on. And some of the highlights, highlighting priority activities that they've set are in the years to come, and you'll probably hear from some of the speakers touch on these, are an inclusive and innovative approach to learning and teaching, and integrating the transnational cooperation in higher education, research and innovation, and securing a sustainable future through higher education. And so today I'm joined by, as I said, some incredible panelists. Right next to me is Martina, the president of the European Students' Union. Her role in the organization, the roles around organization policy development on social dimension. She advocates towards the BFUG, is on project coordination in relation to access to higher education and academic freedom, and is a representative of ESU in many different ways, as a vice president of the Lifelong Learning platform and board member of the Global Campaign for Education, just to name a few. So thank you, Martina. And then right next to her is actually another alumni of the European Students' Union, Fernando. Fernando is the consulting manager of Aquarius European University Alliance and has 10 years of experience working in European higher education policies. Before joining the Aquarius, Fernando was the head of international engagement at CRU, Universidad Español, the Spanish Rectors Conference, and he's also worked as a policy and project officer at Urashi, and was the president of ESU in 2015-2016. So we have two presidents with us, which is great. And hopefully what will be joining us is Helena from the EUA, the European University Alliances, who has been working there since 2018. She's a policy and project officer, specifically in institutional development and unit. And she works particularly in learning and teaching activities and academic recognition. So we look forward to her joining. She was a lecturer formerly at University of Austria. And also joining is Antonio Sereno, a member of the EQUA board since 2019, director of Aragon Agency and Quality Assurance and Strategic Foresight in Higher Education, based in Spain. So We have some incredible panelists joining us, but I'm going to first hand over to Martina to give us some insight into Bologna with student eyes and how that relates to the European education area.
Is this working? Okay. That should be showing on the screen. So.
Oh, it's working. Yes.
It's. Aha, there we go. Fantastic. So, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Zamzam, for the introductions. And I'd like to start off by giving you a bit of an insight into student participation inside the European higher education area. And I'd like to open up with a very well-sticking quote for me. It's a quote from a very important figure, an important stakeholder for students. It's Sjoerd Bergen. He's the head of the Council of Europe's Education Department. And he sent over this reflection for our 30-year anniversary. That was 10 years ago. We'll be celebrating our 40-year anniversary. And he said, basically, students are learners as well as social actors. Being citizens and members of a community implies looking beyond the boundaries of one's institution and country. So students, as members of our community, and not just as clients, have a stake in the development in European higher education, as well as in the development of Europe to its core. Those of us who are no longer students should be happy that they do and that students have ESU to represent them, because without ESU's active contribution, often critical, almost always constructive, we would have had a much less interesting and challenging European higher education area. So I hope this gives a little bit of an insight into the relevance of student participation in this intergovernmental process. And I'll start off by going a little bit into how did ESU make the EHEA more interesting and challenging exactly. What is ESU currently doing at the moment to enhance student participation in the European higher education area? And then go a little bit more on the upcoming initiatives that we are going to be undergoing in this current mandate to support student participation. So why exactly was ESU important inside the Bologna process, inside the European higher education area? I'll give this in a sort of a timeline that I was happy to fact check with Fernando prior to giving the presentation as well. It was started in 1999, where ESU was present but not formally invited to the first ever conference of the European higher education area, this intergovernmental process on higher education and how we can better the systems, the synergies, the policies of our learning and our teaching. And we were actually sponsored to be there through one of now our National Union of Students members, UDU, in Italy. From then on, in 2001, that is when we saw the official recognition of consultative members and ESU being the official student representative inside the Bologna process. We played a very important role there in introducing public good, public responsibility, student participation, and the social dimension in the Prague communique. In 2003, in Berlin, that was when we first produced the publication Bologna with Student Eyes. For those of you who are hearing this publication for the first time, it is a review that we conduct prior to each ministerial conference every 3 to 4 years, where we hand out a massive survey to our member unions. We have 45 national unions of students from 40 different countries, and through them, we can assess what is the actual situation for higher education in the institutional and national levels. So what is it, are they seeing the commitments that their ministers are making in the communiques actually happen in real life, or is that not really happening? In 2005, then, we went on to sneakily affirm mandatory student participation in quality assurance. I'll go a little bit more in depth of how important that is as well for student participation later on. But this was done through a very important policy called the European Standards and Guidelines for Quality Assurance. Until then, 2015, that is when we co-chaired the working group on social dimension and lifelong learning for the first time. That is when we played a very important role in introducing student-centered learning inside the ESGs. Then on to 2018 in Paris, again co-chairing one of the working groups. It's a very prominent role for student representatives to have in co-chairing these working groups, where the members of these working groups are experts, ministries, ministry representatives from the member states of the European higher education area. Basically that was also the time when Fernando was around and it was their work, the students managed to see that we get formal invitations to contribute in the Bologna implementation report, as well as that all the working documents become publicly available on the HEA website. Again, then in the last ministry conference, we co-chaired the social dimension advisory group for the second time, and that saw the development of the principles and guidelines for strengthening the social dimension in the HEA. For those of you that are just hearing like different policies and the little advancements, for us, this incremental implementation of student participation, of student involvement is really what we are fighting for, and what we can see then can cause a domino effect towards the local level. So they might seem like small achievements right now, but in the long run, they have seen a lot of improvements in the local level for student participation in Europe. So what is ESU now doing to enhance student participation in the European higher education area? Well, we mostly learn, and learn. We're constantly learning. As many of you know, we hold elections every year. That is the reality for all of our student unions as well. Holding elections means that you have people change in and out of the student movement almost every year. So you have to restart the process again of understanding the different procedures, the different committees, the different policies. So it's quite a strenuous thing that we have to ensure, particularly through our handovers. But apart from that, what really helps us to enhance student participation is by actually taking ownership in project implementation. We apply for projects through the Erasmus+, for example, and we get to coordinate those projects. Not only partner in projects, like we're very grateful to be partnering in STUPS, but we also coordinate our own projects. We lead the agenda. And that's really what gives us sort of the experience, particularly through European-wide research. So as I mentioned, through our membership, we conduct multiple surveys. We bother them all the time to get their input, their data, their knowledge, as many of you here can relate how annoying it is to get those emails, but how important it is for us to go on paper to our meetings and say, hey, listen, this is the situation, this is the evidence that we have. And apart from that, through our projects, we also get to conduct a number of gatherings, workshops, activities with different stakeholders. We don't want to work alone. We want to work with the stakeholders that can really help to achieve what we want. And I'm going to be talking about the BWSC Forward project. In full, it's called Bologna with Stakeholders' Eyes, so not only students, but stakeholders, for a stronger future of the Bologna process. Why? Because we saw that working together with stakeholders is better than working alone. As I mentioned, we put out this publication every 3 to 4 years before the ministerial conference of the Bologna process. And through this project, we were able to outsource as well researchers to come and cross-check our data. We were able to conduct peer learning activities where we not only had student representatives, but we had ministry representatives, we had representatives from quality assurance agencies, from institutions, coming together and discussing the problems that we found in the BWSC publication and how can we solve those issues together. And now we're moving into the phase of creating a green paper. It's sort of the first stage of a proposal in Parliament as to how to better the situation for student participation. That was one of the issues that has been highlighted in the Bologna process for years and years and years. And as well for recognition of prior learning and internationalization and mobility. Our aims of the project, as I mentioned before, we're working with a number of stakeholders. Why? Because that is the way that we feel like we can build more trust through cooperation and partnership. It also enables more knowledge sharing between us, more capacity building, and as well then that we can have evidence-based policy making. And why? Basically, we've been seeing cycle after cycle. Now we're coming to the fact, okay, our policies are great. We're talking about social dimension, we're talking about micro-credentials, we're talking about all these innovative policies. Now, what's the next step? What's the next step for these next 10 years? Do we want to keep reinventing the wheel? Or do we want to focus on what we have and support the perfection of implementation of these reforms? So, as I mentioned, we based our activities within the Bologna BWSC Forward project on the publication and what we found. Of course, on paper, we asked our unions, okay, are there any laws? Is there any regulation to ensure that there is a minimum level of student participation in decision-making bodies at national level, institutional level, or program level? And on paper, the situation looks pretty good for formally recognizing student participation in the law. But as you've all been discussing over these past 2 days, in reality, it's not as great. Why? The challenges that our unions have been expressing to us in the survey is primarily, first of all, the commodification of higher education, which basically means that the role of higher education is more seeming like preparing students for the labor market rather than not so much focusing on creating engaged, democratically engaged citizens. And the point of when your studies become very strenuous on you, that you don't feel like you can take the time off to participate in student unions, because yes, you do need to divide your time between your studies and activism, and not everybody is able to do that, and that is a reality, and not really up to the students' own decision most of the time. Another challenge is that there's no influence really where it matters, where student representatives could be consulted, often very late, like a couple of days before the meeting, and they get the access to information like 2 days before the meeting. So that doesn't really facilitate them to come prepared for the meeting and be able to hold their points. Another issue is too few seats provided, where if you have a much lower proportion of student representatives to other stakeholders, as I mentioned, you have student representatives constantly changing, whereas if you have deans or professors who have been working in these institutions for years, it's understandable that students can feel a bit intimidated to be speaking up about certain and be critical on certain issues. Another threat is threats to democratic student participation. That's becoming quite worrying as well in Europe, but all over the world, where you have student representatives not able to democratically elect their representatives onto those boards or those committees, but rather they're cherry-picked, tokenistically selected by the staff. There could be external pressure that you could be getting from the high above you for the positions that you'll be taking, particularly if they don't meet the same expectations as other stakeholders. As well, another important thing is financial impact on the autonomy of student representation. Usually, students rely heavily on being able to operate through funds. If they can get those funds, it's it's a bit questionable whether there are any strings attached towards those funds. So how do we move on from here? How can we influence student participation? There are a lot of challenges we need to address. So how can we start building ourselves better and more strong? And where we can really sort of enhance our legitimacy to enable student governance and student participation in decision-making is primarily by trying as much as possible to influence the conception of students. Many times we're looked at as clients. We're here to sit and listen to our lecture, get a service, and goodbye, thank you, graduate, and off you go. No, it's important to influence that and show how students are also citizens, also there at higher education for their own personal development, for coming out and having these transversal skills, for being critical thinkers, for having leadership skills. Secondly, influence formal and informal legal provisions. This is where we're talking about the levels of participation. Ensure that you can get access to information of what student unions there are on your campus. Ensure that you know how you can elect those people. Ensure that you know what the meetings are going to be about if you are elected and you're interested in what the proceedings are going on. Another point, higher education environment. And this is really important in terms of the diversification of student body. The more inclusive we are with each other, the stronger that we can be together, because we have more students, more voices, more power in numbers. And finally, and an important part, is the training and the capacity building of student representatives. Again, it's often a limitation that we have people always changing. But it can be seen as an opportunity because we have people, our alumni, who have so much expertise. Usually they're taking up positions remaining in higher education bubble. So it's important to reach out to them or also find opportunities for resources for training of new student representatives. I'd like to now also take a bit of a quote from another important stakeholder for the student movement, Dr. Manja Klemencic. She's a professor at Harvard, and she was the chairperson for ESU back in 1999 when we were really pushing for our presence in the Bologna process. And she says, it's important not to forget, but rather to draw on the successes of the involvement of student representatives in the Bologna-initiated policy processes, such as when we sneakily involved student participation into quality assurance through the ESGs, but also from the EHEA's political endorsement that first led to improved student participation in national level higher education policy making. So basically what this says is history is important. Always look back on it and always find where to learn and do better. And why is student participation in quality assurance setting such a good model and sustainable model for us to build on further advocating for student participation? Formal provisions. So they started off with the European Standards and Guidelines, this policy document for quality assurance, and in it, we mandated student participation. It was written for everybody to not go against, basically. And that provides an enabling framework. It considers students along with other institutional actors, and through this policy document, they initiated different structures. The TPGs is one, but also the National Quality Assurance Agencies registered within ECAR. So these are basically decentralized institutions that support the implementation of quality assurance according to the European Standards and Guidelines. So we have the formal provision, you have the institution, so you have actual human resources behind that, that agenda, and you have training. Training and qualification of European and national external review experts. For example, within ESU, we are operating a quality assurance students experts pool. We put out a call every once a year in order to gather as many students as we can who are interested in enhancing their knowledge and their skills on how to participate in quality assurance. So On 3, the pot fits, we say, in multis. So you have all of these very important elements to protect and keep supporting student participation, ensuring that it's not only a law and that's it, okay, let's move on, but that there's more, that there's a continuous support line for student participation. What next? I promised my presentation is soon coming to an end. Finally, upcoming initiatives that we are doing to enhance student participation internally. For those of you who are interested as well, we're looking to enhance our engagement with both with our full members, but also with our associate members. We'll be revising our membership strategy soon. We'll also be looking to reapply for the Bologna with Student Eyes Forward project, so 2.0. And externally, this is part of our plan of work that our board has adopted at our last board meeting. They mandate us to analyze quality assurance approaches to students in Europe, particularly because we're seeing some problems for student participation and quality assurance. Over the EU, we're looking at enhancing democratic student participation within the European universities. Around the EHEA, we're now in 9 working groups / task forces of the Bologna follow-up group for this next 3-year cycle of the Bologna process. And I'm very happy that as well our representatives from our national unions of students are also inside those working groups. And globally, we're also now, we've recently launched a comparative research project called Student Impact on Higher Education globally. It is being coordinated together with the Global Students Forum and Dr. Manja Klemencic, who I mentioned earlier, where basically we're going to be documenting the reality for student movements, the narrative that we would like to be remembered by in history for student representation and student governance. Okay, I hope to have caught your interest in the topic. Thank you for your attention and happy to take any further questions.
Thank you, Martina. So Martina went way over, but I hope that was really, really informative and actually really set, I guess, a good grounding and foundation of what's been happening and what is happening and how you can get involved. I'm gonna go now on to hopefully one of our colleagues on the Zoom. Literally, as I said that, they disappeared behind me. But Helena from EUA to give a perspective of student participation from the lens of learning, teaching, and quality assurance. So I'm going to hand over to Helena.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. Good, and I'll jump right into it. First of all, thank you for having me, and sorry for having been a bit late to the party, but I will make it up by being rather quick with my presentation because actually it addresses a lot of points or answers to a lot of points that were already raised by Martina. So you might find that rather interesting. Let me just start screen sharing. I hope everything goes well here. Okay, I think you can see my slide. Yes, very good. So as you can see from the title, I will rather focus on student participation seen through the lens of learning and teaching and quality assurance. On the one hand, because these are the two topics or two fields through which EUA, the European University Association, mostly deals with the topic of student participation, but also because particularly learning and teaching is the field I work on most with. So I will in the following explain a bit what EUA's view is on the topic of student participation and which considerations have emerged on the topic through EUA's work on learning and teaching and quality assurance. Broadly speaking, I think I can state that the topic is of crucial relevance to universities. It is on the one hand an important way for them to ensure that their governance, policies, procedures and activities reflect the needs and also ensure ownership among students, which is ultimately a quality matter. But on the other hand, it is also, and this is part of what Martina addressed, it is a step towards fostering active citizenship and many valuable related skills among students. So this is then also a way for universities to address their societal responsibility. But what precisely does this mean for learning and teaching? I can start with practicalities. At EUA, we try to have student participation not only as a topic we work on, but also as a lived practice. We have a very good cooperation with ESSU, in the sense that there's always a permanent member of ESSU in many of our program and steering committees. Among them is, for example, the EUA Learning and Teaching Steering Committee, which guides EUA's learning and teaching activities. Among these learning and teaching activities, we have the so-called EUA Learning and Teaching Thematic Peer Groups, which is an annual activity. We have each year 3 to 4 groups, each on a different topic, consisting of a number of European university representatives to talk about a specific topic, for example, curriculum design, active learning, etc. And each of the participating universities is invited and actively encouraged to also include or bring a student to work in the group itself on equal footing. So not just to provide feedback on what the group comes up with, but to be a specific group member dedicated to the group. And so on the one hand, we do have student participation in the groups themselves, but in the following slides, I will also present a couple of selected findings which might be of interest to the topic of student participation. What we have found generally through our learning and teaching activities and through the thematic peer groups is that there are many universities across Europe that have some sort of model for student participation, different scales, different types, but the will and the interest are certainly there. The bigger challenge is thus not the why, but the how of student participation. So how to do it meaningfully so it does not end up being a simple box ticking exercise. And one key challenge associated with this is the context. One size does not fit all, and some universities, some regions and some countries have more experience with student participation than others and have maybe more of a tradition of student participation. So you always need to consider the basis you are building on, including the workload of the students they have in that particular institution or country or region, the flexibility they have in their study lives would then allow them to dedicate some more time to involvement in governance and student unions, etc. Based on this, you would then also have to consider, of course, the scope. There are many ways of allowing for student participation or encouraging student participation. So if participation in governance structures or decision-making bodies is not part of the picture just yet, you could also try with curriculum or course design, involving students in designing learning spaces, timetables, etc. So these are examples that one particular TPG, thematic peer group, on fostering engagement in developing learning and teaching brought up as crucial measures to form a true partnership between teachers and students. But this has been echoed by many other TPGs. We've had, for example, a TPG on curriculum design, which specifically recommended to involve students in the design processes for curricula. What this group came up with is it identified 9 components of what they call an ideal curriculum, with student participation being one of these 9 components through 2 main strands. On the one hand, student-centered learning, but they also bring up participation of students in decision-making bodies. And they recommend the student participation as an element of an ideal curriculum on the one hand, because it fosters a culture of institutional co-ownership among students, staff, leadership, etc. But they also highlight that the student perspective has the valuable benefit of highlighting what they call the hidden curriculum, which are certain intangible hidden aspects of the curriculum, like certain values or norms that are not part of the explicit intended learning outcomes. And this is where students' perspectives can help in major ways. An important point they raise, though, is that in order to avoid students just being used as communication channels between the institution on the one side and the students, the body of students on the other side, is that some students might need first a bit of training on certain institutional aspects they might not naturally be knowledgeable about if you want to allow for real student participation, real input, and real partnership with students. Another interesting aspect that was brought up by another thematic peer group on the topic of empowering students for the future professional life and civic engagement is acknowledgement. What Martina said right at the beginning, students need to put time and effort aside and work aside for involvement in student unions, any type of extra engagement and participation also in decision-making bodies, giving feedback on university governance. All this takes time. And in order for students not to feel that this is a wasted time or it's not being noticed or it's a wasted effort, you need to acknowledge this kind of extra effort somehow. And this TPG brought up examples of acknowledging extra engagement outside the formal curriculum, for example, in student organizations or unions, through awarding ECTS credits, or by including a mention of this kind of extra engagement in the diploma supplement. So to emphasize the value of this kind of engagement and therefore encourage further engagement in the future, so it doesn't stop somewhere. Another point they raise is that digital badging could be introduced for this kind of engagement to make it visible, and especially to make visible the kind of leadership skills students who participate in governance structures or unions and organizations develop or have developed through their work. And finally, on the topic of learning and teaching, two further key aspects to it are two hot topics in higher education at the moment, which is active and student-centered learning. In 2018, we had a TPG on the topic of promoting active learning in universities, which majorly advocated for an idea, a conception or a change of conception from students away from consumers of knowledge to students as co-creators of knowledge. So real partners in education and co-creators of the education process itself. And they do recommend that in order for this conception to be a lived reality and to really go into every facet of higher education at the institution, students need to be involved at all levels in redesigning or designing higher education. This includes in academic strategies and policies, curriculum, so curriculum design again, learning spaces and timetables, assessment practices is the other coin of the learning process, as well as the use of technology. So I have now talked quite a lot about learning and teaching, and I will be very quick on the QA part because I'm sure that Antonio will still say a couple of words on that, and Martina has already covered quite a bit. Also here I can say that students are permanent members, or I have to say we have a very good partnership with ESSO here too, because students are permanent members of the European Quality Assurance Forum Program Committee, together with EUA, ANQUA, and Eurassia members. But EUA also has a permanent student representative in the Institutional Evaluation Program Committee, or Program Committee. The Institutional Evaluation Program is a quality assurance agency under the umbrella of EUA. And under the IAP program, we conduct expert evaluations with student members in each evaluation. Here again, we have a very good cooperation going on with ESU, which I needed to highlight. Martina has already mentioned the ESG, so I can only add that yes, the standard 2.4 does stipulate or does express the the expectation that external quality assurance should be carried out with external experts, including at least a or student members, so at least one student member, and IAP is in line with this expectation, as are in any way most quality assurance agencies these days. And one important point before I hand back to the panel is that also here we provide training to not only the student expert panel members, but to all panel members in general. So here again, we have this recommendation that certain training is needed, but that once you provide this training, you can certainly work in very well collaborations with students as partners in quality assurance as well as in learning and teaching. And I will end here and remain available for any questions. And I hope that there will be questions from the audience or maybe from the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena. Massive round of applause to her. So our next speaker is Fernando, hopefully giving us an insight into university alliances across Europe.
Thank you very much, Samsa. Well, thank you very much first to ESU. I always feel at home when I receive an invitation from former colleagues, but also to the University of Huelva for organizing the event and leading the STAPS project. I think also the director of the university at its opening speech also was very clear. It's an important topic, but we should also, there is always a difference between policy and practice. And that's the bridge we have all to try to build together, because sometimes it's not as easy as it seems. It's also my first actual face-to-face event post-COVID, even in a hybrid format. So that's also quite exciting for me to actually being able to interact again with people. So next slide, please. Yeah, I will try to focus on these 4 areas. So talking a little bit about student engagement in the Arcus Alliance. Sorry for the formatting, apparently it went a little bit wrong, but yeah, doesn't matter. And a little bit about the European Universities Initiative itself, because that's something new in a way. What we are trying to do in Arcus, then the formal participation of students within the Alliance, and then some of the challenges that we are having also in engaging students. So those will be the aspects. And in this sense, that's something that is important. I think context matters. So how many of you are able to tell me when the Erasmus class or the Erasmus program was actually initiated? Which year or decade at least? Come on, that's not so new. In the 80s, 1987 exactly, and it was promoted by the French President Mitterrand, together with the Spanish Prime Minister Felipe González, actually from the Andalusian region, which promoted this. And this was something crazy. I mean, of course, the union could not do anything about education. How the hell the union will have a program on education for supporting students to be mobile? This obviously, they managed to convince the rest of the member states back then. And it was actually a start of the union working on education. I think Martina has focused quite a lot on the European higher education area. That's why I'm trying to talk a little bit about the union's initiative in this sense. So actually, it doesn't end up into the treaties until '92 with the Maastricht Treaty, and has not even changed ever since. So education is a supporting competence of the union. That means they have nothing to do. They can only support member states. So they can do program as Erasmus Plus program for supporting mobility. They can finance nice policy projects like STAPS, but they cannot set any kind of policy around it. So that's also a little bit, and also member states were very clear that they don't want to give up this competence. And this is also why the Bologna process actually started in a way as intergovernmental process, something like, okay, the union will participate, but it will be actually decided by the governments, and they will have the final say when actually implementing the policies back at the countries. So next slide, please. Yeah. Here you have the speech by Macron at the Sorbonne University in 2017. And he talked about something that he called European universities, like if the current universities will not be European. But yeah, he created this concept of European universities as a network of universities across Europe. He said also that we should have at least 20 by 2024. And by the next academic year, we should try to have at least the first of those European universities. He talks also about European semesters, European degree, so on and so forth. This actually was very interesting because we were living also a time in the Bologna process where progress was not so fast anymore. There were not nice policies. Countries were hesitant to implement some of those things. So there was also this fight or these tensions between progressing on European cooperation on education and the Bologna process not being the right tool at that moment. So Commission went crazy. I've never seen, and most of you that have been in Brussels probably have not seen such a rapid move of the Commission. They rapidly take it over, bring it into a communication, bring it to the Council. The Council made a resolution. And by the end of 2017, we actually had, from the main bodies of the Union, we have resolutions that we should move forward with the European Universities Initiative. Something crazy for the Brussels normal timing, where they need to make an impact assessment, then budgeting, and it takes quite a while, which normally makes sense, obviously. But this was quite a rapid move. And they actually made the first call quite quickly. They were expecting to finance a few universities at the very beginning, just 6 probably. And suddenly they found some extra money behind the carpets. This will tell us where they hide this money. And they actually financed 17 in the first round and another 24 on the second round in 2020. So there are already a total of 41 European Universities Alliances. And they frame this initiative into what they call the European Education Area, that they wanted to have it ready by 2025. So if we move to the next slide, please, Samsa, let me know 3 minutes before my time is over, just to not use most of the time. So I try to compare here a little bit what the European Higher Education Area was trying to do and what the EU was trying to do with this European Education Area. Obviously, EHEA is only for higher education. The education area of the European Union, it's for all educational levels, only for EU member states, while in EHEA, we have 49 countries at the moment. And also the European Education Area in terms of higher education, they had also the work on automatic recognition of degrees, a strong focus also on mobility and helping facilitating that mobility with things like the European Student Card Initiative and then the European University Initiative as an kind of excellence initiative, but at the same time inclusive. So it's weird how you combine that sometimes. And then we have the different tools. One aspect also being in ESU and being in the BFEG board, it's a stakeholder involvement in the Bologna process is quite clear and it has quite a strong influence. While, for example, it's not the case so much or so many times in the EU processes themselves. We know Parliament is great, but the EU Parliament is not that powerful as it should be. And stakeholder involvement is also not as powerful as, for example, ESU got in the BFEG, for example. So, of course, ESU is in the education and training working groups and so on, but policies are not so highly influenced by the stakeholders as in other things. However, we should also keep in mind that the Bologna process is a process that costs money, and it's also highly financed by the Erasmus Plus program. So the Commission also pays for the party. So if they don't see progress, they will not finance it. So it's also an equilibrium that you have to pay there a little bit of attention. So enough about context, we move forward. Next slide, please. And what are we trying to do in the Arcus Alliance? So the Arcus Alliance at the moment is composed of 7 universities. We call ourselves 7 long-standing comprehensive research universities. For the Spanish context, that's something weird to say because in general we are all, but you know that there are different types and systems of universities. Not all universities in Europe are research intense, not all of them are comprehensive universities. So there are 7 long-standing research intense universities, quite internationalized, that have worked a lot together and have strong links with the context, with the socioeconomic context in the regions. Also, most of them, we have one exception always, obviously, are not in capital cities. But as the Vilnius University colleague says, Vilnius is a small city in a small country, so a small capital. So it can count almost as a non-capital city. And we have organized our work in 6 main action lines or content work, each of them being coordinated by one of our universities, but all of the 7 universities are participating in them. So first one, and I would like to focus here, it's the one led by Bergen University in Norway, which is about engaged European citizens. And we did this very thoughtfully, being this an initiative which was only open for Erasmus plus program countries. So EU member states plus the rest of the participating countries within Erasmus. Obviously now, for example, not anymore open to the UK or to other Bologna countries. We wanted to make very clear that European citizen is not just about the EU. It goes way beyond it. So that's why actually Norway, as non-EU country, was leading this action line. And it's a lot about experimenting with challenge-based learning. We have 2 main challenges at the moment. One is climate change, another is also European identity and integration. And for example, there are groups of students and professors, teachers from different fields working together in the issue of climate change at the moment. So we have colleagues from philosophy, from physics, from mathematics, from law. So trying to see the issue of climate change from these different angles and what type of solutions can we put forward on the table. And this is a very participatory process where the teachers are acting more as coaches, and it's a joint work of the teachers and the students. We have an action line devoted to a student-centered frameworks for quality learning, so you can identify a little bit of the ESU language there. So it's a lot about mobility, but it's also about pedagogical training for teachers in terms of how to help them to actually do a student-centered learning. Here we got an open mobility agreement so that our students will be able to freely move between the 7 universities. The third one that you have on the screen, not anymore although, but you will be able to see it in a moment. It's multilingual and multicultural university led by Leipzig University. We have 6 working languages at the different universities, plus English as a common one. But yeah, Europe is quite multilingual and multicultural, so we consider that's also an important aspect to have in mind. Widening access, inclusion, and diversity, led by the University of Padova. They have an incredible experience, and I think they have been, thank you, Samsa, they have been also quite partnership with ESU in some things, and for example, refugees recognition and so on. Entrepreneurial University and Regional Engagement by Lyon, and research support and early stage researchers by Graz, also very Graz University, very research intense university, and main coordination by Granada. So if we go to next slide. Yes, please. Okay, thank you. There you have a little bit of the ideas of we are actually trying to do in practice. So staff development, both for teaching and admin staff, fostering joint research, joint programs, both in terms of within the 3 cycles, but also with micro-credentials and source cycles. Open mobility, both of students and the staff. Common policies, because we are actually trying to build an alliance, a university, and share resources. I think this is also quite interesting for me, like sharing resources, for example, of research infrastructure. If the University of Granada has a supercomputer, which maybe, let's say maybe, Graz University does not have, then a colleague from Graz could use the supercomputer of Granada. And a colleague from Granada could use another laboratory that we don't have in Granada, but there is in Bergen, for example. and that we will open for the community, since for library, learning object repository, and so on. If we go to the next slide, and sorry for clicking on that because I think that the last one is the most interesting one. This is our organizing structure. I just want to call your attention that we have a ARCUS Student Council that was explicitly mentioned already at the time of the application. So the alliance was designed already with a student council. The student council has 2 representatives in the steering committee. So in the steering committee, there are 2 representatives per university, plus the steering committee, plus the student council, and the student council is a voting member of the steering committee. So they have the same weight as any of the member institutions of the alliance. If we move to the next slide, this is the composition of the student council. So there are 2 representatives for each university. They have the mandate to be responsible for coordinating student involvement and ensuring student input and feedback to alliance activities and policies. We just foreseen, or what was foreseen in the applications, like there will be a student committee, student council, but we will not tell them how to organize themselves. That will be very much up to them. So this has been challenging, but that's something that we consider we could not prescribe from our side. Next slide, and final one. These are the challenges, and I think this is the interesting things to discuss with you. How to motivate the students actually to engage. I think it's a very interesting initiative. We are being the pioneers of the future initiative of the union, something that probably will be shaping the higher education systems, not only at the national level, but also at the European level. But it's important to facilitate those processes. It's not just enough to make the space. It's not only enough to have the seat. You have to put the stairs for the person to get to the seat, to find the table to get to the seat, to be able to be prepared to say something that he actually or she actually can contribute to and will be listened. And that's actually not an easy process. After you have facilitated all that process, you have also to value that contribution, because then again, students come to the university to get educated, and their contribution to the management, governance, is also an extra thing we ask them from. So we have to value, recognize that by credits, and recognize that as ambassadors of the alliance. And the fourth one, as I was saying, not only valuing, also recognizing in terms of credits in their diploma supplements, because there is also learning outcomes that you will get out of student participation. And to simple things as a letter of recommendation, for example, is something that we are also trying to do. Next slide, just to finish with the motto of the Alliance, which is building bridges towards a safe future. And yeah, I will stop here, looking forward to any questions from your side. And sorry for speaking fast, and thank you for the interpreters for their huge work. So next slide, you have there the contact details, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. A very, very rich presentation, and I hope you guys are all preparing some questions to be asking straight after our last speaker. Antonio, I will be presenting next, and then hopefully we're going to go to a Q&A and have some questions lined up.
Okay. Okay, do you see the presentation?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Do you hear me well? Okay. Then good afternoon or good evening, I would say, and thank you very much for the invitation to the DEVA agency, to the Universidad de Huelva and the STUPS project. And as we are in Huelva, in Andalusia, and you are lucky that you are in Huelva, Andalusia, and I am here in Zaragoza, in the middle of Aragon, this region in Spain. I'm going, the presentation is in English, and as you have in, I think, in 45-minute dinner, I'm going to talk in Spanish, okay? Then, my perspective is from the external quality assurance perspective, from the external quality assurance in higher education, representing ENQA. And only when I give some examples, I will talk as director of the ACPUA, the Aragon Agency for Quality Assurance in Higher Education. Bueno, como yo creo que esto no hace falta explicarlo, ENQA es una asociación que representa a las... la más importante y la más amplia de las agencias de calidad europeas. Fue creada en el año 2000, y de hecho no pudimos celebrar nuestro aniversario por culpa de la pandemia. Pero lo más importante es que ENQA crece con el Plan Bolonia, que sus raíces están firmemente asentadas en el Plan Bolonia. Por tanto, cree firmemente en el acceso de los estudiantes a la educación superior, donde obtienen una calificación que sea reconocida también universalmente. ENQA actualmente tiene 55 miembros repartidos en 31 países. Sí. Para ser miembro de pleno derecho de ENQA es preciso ser evaluado cada 5 años y demostrar el cumplimiento de los estándares europeos. Esto significa que hay países del espacio europeo de educación superior donde todavía no hay una garantía de la calidad adaptada a los European Standards and Guidelines. También hay otros tipos de miembros que no tienen que pasar esta evaluación. Son los afiliados. Hay 55 repartidos por 34 países, incluso fuera del espacio europeo. Bien, si pasamos rápidamente a los objetivos, aparte de representar los intereses de las agencias de calidad y de proporcionar servicios a los miembros y a los stakeholders, empezando por los estudiantes, el objetivo principal de ENQA es el de conducir el desarrollo de la garantía de calidad externa en Europa. Y dentro de esta tercera misión es muy importante para nosotros la participación de los estudiantes. Las actividades, por falta de tiempo, no voy a explicarlas. Martina ya ha contado la historia de las conferencias de los ministros de Educación Superior, del Bologna Follow-up Group. Lo más importante es que, como diré ahora, coordinamos las evaluaciones externas de las agencias. Somos los que evaluamos a los evaluadores de las universidades. Las agencias que examinan la universidad. Y en el corazón de ENQA hay una visión de una Europa de ciudadanos, como veis allí, en sociedades que son democráticas y sostenibles, con acceso a la educación para todos y donde los graduados del espacio europeo, ¿no?, obtienen un conocimiento sólido, amplio, útil a nivel regional y a nivel global y que además inspira su desarrollo personal. Bien. Nos regimos, evidentemente, por los European Standards and Guidelines, actualmente en su versión de 2015, como ha señalado también Martina anteriormente. ¿Cómo nos preocupamos de la participación de los estudiantes? Voy a plantear una serie de cuestiones. En primer lugar, dirigiéndonos a las autoridades, a los gobiernos, para que permitan e intensifiquen la participación de los estudiantes. Sí, como se ve en la slide, en la diapositiva, una de las 4 recomendaciones que formuló ENQA a la última conferencia de ministros del espacio europeo fue justamente la importancia de respetar y de fomentar el involvement, el compromiso de los estudiantes en actividades de garantía de la calidad. Esto es importantísimo y es una preocupación esencial de ENCUA. ENCUA, además, y esto está disponible en la página web de ENCUA, tiene documentos y ofrece guidelines a las universidades y a las propias agencias para fomentar este compromiso de los estudiantes. Recordemos, como se dice en esa recomendación de ENCUA, que actualmente solo que todavía una de 7 agencias no cumple con el estándar de participación de estudiantes en las actividades de garantía de calidad. Y creo que no debemos olvidar en un meeting como este que para que la participación de los estudiantes fructifique es preciso que se lleven adelante otro tipo de reformas y se remuevan otro tipo de obstáculos. Por eso, la recomendación de fomentar la participación de los estudiantes, aquí la había unido a la recomendación de crear y salvaguardar condiciones que permitan a las agencias actuar con independencia y flexibilidad. Es decir, en una nueva fase en la que seguramente estamos de Teaching and Learning en Europa, apostando por flexibilidad de los aprendizajes, microcredenciales, otra concepción de la vida del estudiante y de la carrera del estudiante, es muy importante también que haya pasos por parte de los gobiernos, de las universidades y de las agencias, para que al mismo tiempo se desarrolle en una nueva dimensión la participación de los estudiantes. Sí. Sí. Un caso que nos preocupa mucho es los efectos de la pandemia y la fase de pospandemia en la que estamos. ENCUA ha dedicado varios webinars, ha hecho encuestas a las agencias sobre lo que ha supuesto la pandemia en relación con su modo de trabajar, pero también en relación con la garantía de la calidad en tiempos de pandemia. Aquí quería decir que, como se ve en el slide, es muy importante tener una nueva guidance regulatoria, nuevas normas adaptadas a la situación. ENCUA, en este sentido, ha animado a las agencias a mantener un diálogo con las universidades y con los gobiernos. Es muy importante también que las agencias colaboren entre sí y que la respuesta de las agencias a la pandemia no sea demasiado burocrática, no sea demasiado procedimental, ¿no? Sí, que acompañe a las universidades en esta transformación de la modalidad de la docencia hacia formatos híbridos o virtuales. Esto es muy importante. Es muy importante también proporcionar por parte de las agencias, y lo hemos hecho. En el caso de mi agencia, PUA, la Agencia de Aragón, hemos hecho guidelines para facilitar protocolos de visita online en las evaluaciones, en las reviews, o también para evaluar teaching online. Sí. Son muy importantes las nuevas herramientas tecnológicas. Es muy importante la nueva actitud ante el trabajo por parte de todos. Más comunicación, más trabajo en equipo, más creatividad en tiempos de pandemia. Pero es importantísimo y crucial que las agencias recibamos feedback de los estudiantes. sobre el impacto de la pandemia y sobre las consecuencias que están teniendo en su educación. En el caso nuestro hemos abierto un Actua Plus Students Strategic Forum con la intención de recibir feedback directo de los estudiantes. En ENCUA nos interesa mucho esta cuestión. Pero claro, naturalmente, la forma de trabajar de las agencias de calidad es mediante las evaluaciones. Y ENCUA lo que hace es exigir a las agencias que haya una participación de los estudiantes, un compromiso de los estudiantes en las actividades de evaluación, de acuerdo con los European Students and Guidelines. Okay. Como ha señalado Martina y también Ellen, el estándar de referencia es el estándar 2.4. 2.4. Los estudiantes deben estar en los review teams, en los paneles de evaluación. Lo que hemos visto del cumplimiento por parte de las agencias de este estándar es que en este punto tanto ENCUA como el Registro Europeo ECAR es muy exigente en el cumplimiento de la participación de los estudiantes. Sí. 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 Los review teams de ENCUA quieren que todas las actividades de evaluación que conduce una agencia tenga participación de estudiantes. Incluso esto produce a veces sentimientos de exageración por parte de las universidades o de expertos que estudian el cumplimiento o la evolución de estas evaluaciones. Pero es muy importante, en este punto somos muy exigentes. Y junto al estándar 2.4 está el estándar 3.1, 3.1, donde en la medida en que los estudiantes son stakeholders principales de las agencias, deben estar en los governance bodies, deben estar en los board of directors, en los consejos rectores de las agencias.
Antonio,
esto también, todos los review teams de ENCUA se preocupan por averiguar que haya este cumplimiento. ¿Qué recomendamos a las agencias? Recomendamos a las agencias que desarrollen programas de participación de estudiantes. Student Integration, como aparece allí, Student Participation, Cooperation with Representative of Students, Student Training, Promoting Quality Culture among Students, una comprensión común del Student Centered Learning, que es a veces difícil de interpretar. Feedback de los estudiantes sobre el impacto de la pandemia y algo muy importante también que nos interesa, al menos en Aragón, es entender las necesidades de los estudiantes en transición a la universidad. Es decir, vuestros futuros compañeros en la universidad. Es importante también desarrollar este aspecto, conocer qué quieren estudiar, ser ayudados por los estudiantes de la universidad, and so on. Naturalmente, Student Centered Learning plantea problemas, siempre dificultades para implementación, lo sabemos, pero se ha recorrido un buen camino. Muchas veces las dificultades estriban en los marcos legislativos. Y aquí pongo un ejemplo de una crítica que nos ha hecho la propia ENCUA a nuestra agencia in the Review Report. Tenemos las agencias, nosotros, que desarrollar un una aproximación más coherente al Student-Centered Learning. Y tenemos seguramente que hacer que nuestros evaluadores, nuestros reviewers, tengan una mayor concienciación con el Student-Centered Learning. Sí. Pero en rojo, como dice ahí en el slide, el mismo panel, sí, siempre dice, esta aproximación más consistente, más clara al Student-Centered Learning, que está en la parte 1 de los European Standards, tiene que ser desarrollada a nivel nacional en España. Es decir, es un problema mayor que el de una agencia individual y es muy importante lo que quería decir aquí, que tenemos y que ESU y que las asociaciones de estudiantes también en nuestro país animen a las agencias a desarrollar una aproximación común al Student-Centered Learning. De la misma manera, y termino ya, en acreditación institucional, el otro gran proceso, la visión de los estudiantes y su participación puede ser un interesante valor añadido. Sí. Sabemos que con la pandemia, en la fase aguda de la pandemia, con el lockdown, los sistemas de garantía de calidad de las universidades y de los centros son claves para conocer las necesidades de los estudiantes, sus quejas y reclamaciones, que las ha habido. Esto es muy importante. Por tanto, también la visión institucional. Hay muchas posibilidades donde desarrollar valores adicionales a la acreditación institucional. Pongo solo un ejemplo, por falta de tiempo. En Aragón tenemos un programa, Alceus, que mide el grado de compromiso de la universidad con los Sustainable Development Goals, con la Agenda 2030.
Antonio, can I ask you to wrap up so
Yes.
We can do some Q&A? Thank you.
Okay. To finish? Yes. Then, terminando, sobre el fondo de los estándares, que es la herramienta de trabajo que tenemos las agencias para garantizar la participación de los estudiantes, se puede añadir una tercera visión que en buena medida se basa en la visión de los estudiantes, que debe ser elevada a una categoría estratégica por parte de las agencias. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we are very much running over time, but I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to ask some questions. And I have some questions lined up, but are there any questions from the floor first? Yes. Okay, so can we get a mic around? I see a few questions. As we go around, I'm also going to take share privileges and ask a question. Fernando, you spoke about building the bridge between policy and practice and how key that is. That's actually one of the first things that you mentioned. And I think that is something that resonates with a lot of us, especially on this project, how there has been like multiple policies and guidances, which all relate to innovative practices and ideas, but actually like putting them into practice is the most difficult part. So my question is, what do you think is what do you think is the biggest barriers we face in putting them into practice? What I'm going to ask is to take several questions and you guys can write them down if that's okay, yeah. And then we can answer them all at once if that's cool. So that's my question. Let's go to yourself.
Thanks. I'd like to ask about ARCOS University Alliance. It was mentioned that each university in the alliance is represented by 2 students, and I'd like to ask you how those 2 students are selected. Are they elected or nominated? Who is selecting them, students themselves or the university management?
Thank you very much. I think there was another question somewhere over here.
Yes, I had a question about the EUA presentation. At some point they mentioned about the hidden curriculum, and I wanted to ask how can student representatives and student organizations figure out what values they kind of want to include in the curriculum as to shape up that hidden curriculum part. What's the process of figuring that out? And I also had one question about the university alliances, and I was wondering about ARCUS specifically, and maybe if they have a more general perspective as well. How involved is the average student in activities managed by university alliances, and how involved would the average student be in an ideal situation, and how does this match up?
Thanks.
Thank
Can you
you.
tell us your name and institution?
I'm Mihai from ASD Bucharest.
Thank you very much. And I think there was another question in that area. Oh, it's over there.
Hello, my question is for Antonio, so I'm going to speak in Spanish. Hola, buenas tardes, Antonio. Mi pregunta es si la calidad en cuanto a las universidades durante este año de pandemia ha sido realmente eficiente o no, porque es verdad que, por ejemplo, yo soy de aquí, de la Universidad de Huelva, hemos usado distintas plataformas, como tú bien has dicho, tipo Moodle, Zoom, pero creo que nos hemos visto demasiado limitados. Entonces, no sé si realmente habéis hecho alguna calidad para ver si realmente ha sido eficiente o no, o cómo han sido los resultados de los estudiantes, si realmente han aprendido y han estado motivados o no.
Can you tell us your name and institution as well?
University of Huelva.
And your name?
Zainab. Zainab.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? It's only going to be one round of questions because of time, unfortunately. And I guess finally, if there is another question. Okay, great.
Thanks a lot. It will be very brief. My name is Vicky and I'm here as a freelance higher education expert. I would complete the first question or compliment. How do you are planning to ensure the continuity of student representatives? Because everyone else involved in the project, in the ARCUS project, are from institutions, but not the students. And that can be a problem to take people on board every year. So what's your strategy for that, if you have? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I guess as share privileges, I'm going to ask the final question, specifically to Martina. She spoke about Bologna with student eyes. You mentioned student participation being a commonality found across BWSC publications. Are there any particular issues or case studies that stood out in the latest BWSC, which recently was published? And I'm going to maybe go Fernando first, and then Martina, and then we'll go to our colleagues online. So I'm going to say as brief as possible.
I do my best, but yeah, I think there are very important questions. I will try to answer all together in a way. But first of all, how to bridge policy and practice. I would like to read you one thing and see if any of you can tell me where it's actually from. The involvement of students as competent, active, and constructive partners in the establishment and shaping of the European higher education area is needed and welcomed. Students will participate in and influence in the organization and content of education at universities and other higher education institutions. It's an ESU statement. It is an EU document. Martina?
The EA resolution.
It's actually a communique from 2001. Mm-hmm. So we can see that was already back there. And another example that everybody's talking now about the student-centered learning, apparently it's something completely new. But back in 2007, the communique says there is an increasing awareness of a significant outcome of the process that will lead towards a move towards student-centered higher education and away from teacher-driven provision. We will continue to support this important development. And in the 2009 one, they say, this will be a priority for the further implementation of the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance. So it was only included in 2015, but 2009 Ministerial Conference was already talking about it. So that's actually how you bridge the bridge, how you build the bridge between policy and practice. This was policy from 2009, but until the ESGs were reformed, and ESU, I was sitting on behalf of ESU on the drafting committee of the new ESGs. That was a huge fight. And that's how you slowly build those bridges. So first it's policy, then you put it into a regulatory document, which in this case is the ESGs, and then quality assurance agencies will be evaluated against them, and quality assurance agencies will evaluate the university against that. So it's a long time process. Sometimes it's not as fast as we would like, but that's something that ESU is very good at and should continue doing, building that that bridge. In that regard, if you allow me also for a reflection, student participation should not be only seen as a requirement, but something that is actually beneficial of the institutions, the quality assurance agency, and so on. And Helen maybe can reflect a little bit, because actually IEP did a study about the student participation in the IEP program and how actually it was really, really beneficial, not only for the IEP itself, but for the universities that were evaluated within the program. And also the concept of students participating only in student matters. What is only student matters? The budget of the university is student matter. The IT infrastructure is a student matter. So we have to also go beyond a little bit that type of concepts. To the more concrete questions, how those two students are selected. As I said, we didn't want to prescribe too much how this was organized, so they will be very much open to the students to decide how this will work. So for example, at the moment, they are being selected by the student unions of each university. But then it's a student union how to organize the selection process by themselves. They have also decided to organize in the student council with a president and a vice president with a mandate of 1 year. So that's also something that they discuss and decide themselves. And one thing, as it was mentioned, one thing is formal participation or legitimate participation in the council and the steering committee. The other one is how we actually involve them in NACO's activities. And that's a challenge because this is something that we are having a lot of work in involving actually academics and staff. It's not an easy. There is also the language barriers of time, but they are participating in the task force. They are open to student participation. But then again, we have to facilitate more these processes. And in that sense, training, it's how you actually ensure this handover, this turnout that we all have, that you have in ESU, the handovers, the trainings for the QA pool, that's something that is important. And if you allow me also final question for Martina, it's also we are trying to build something new, something that goes beyond the national system, which are the alliances. How you will see these students being represented at European level, because they will not be represented any longer by the national unions only, or by the student union in their universities. So I guess ESU might have a role to play there.
Absolutely. Before we go to Martina, actually, I'm going to go to Antonio. There was a direct question posed to Antonio. If you could keep the answer to less than 2 minutes.
Yes, sí, very quick. Contesto en español, que me han preguntado en español. Un momento que corte la traducción, que si no escucho la... Sí. Okay. Las agencias ante... Es decir, problemas que ha habido concretos, justo cuando la pandemia, nosotros no podemos actuar directamente. Tenemos que, lo que pedimos a las universidades es, por un lado, tienen que recoger evidencias de todo lo que está pasando y, en segundo lugar, tienen que hacer encuestas, a ser posible, específicas, sobre lo que ha pasado con la pandemia, la transición a una docencia virtual. Luego llegamos nosotros cuando hacemos el follow-up, el seguimiento y las evaluaciones. por esa razón decía justamente que era importante que las agencias también dispongan formas a través de sus estudiantes, por ejemplo, en sus comités, o a través también de foros, formas de obtener feedback de los estudiantes de cara a cómo va a ser la docencia tras la pandemia. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We're going to go to Helena, if there are any reflections and anything you want to add to some of the questions posed by the participants.
Yes, thank you. There was the question about the hidden curriculum and how to shape that in a more active way. So the way that the TPG on curriculum design understood the idea of a hidden curriculum was that it was something, I don't want to say accidental, but rather something unconscious or unintended that is being transmitted, certain values, ideas, norms that are not part of the actual curriculum, but still kind of happen to be in there when you teach the curriculum. But I suppose if you wanted to go about shaping them in a more active way, it would be easiest through graduate attributes. Graduate attributes are the attributes graduates who leave the institution, who graduate from the institution, are supposed to have acquired in a sort of representation of the institutional values, strengths, culture. So if you had a participatory process in which you get together university leadership, the teachers, other staff, graduates or alumni, and current students, in order to jointly define these graduate attributes, you would start a big institutional dialogue or discussion about what exactly makes this institution unique. And then it would automatically be values-based. What are the institution's values? What is its mission? What is its identity? What is specific about it? What is particularly strong about it? And I suppose that this would be a way to invite students, but also for students to take a more active role in shaping any hidden curriculum or, the identity of the institution in a way that reflects in all members of the institution, students and staff alike. I also wanted to very, very quickly confirm, yes, what Fernando said. Yes, IEP did conduct a study on student participants in its reviews. IEP has been including students for the first time in its expert panels in 2009, and 5 years into the process, there was a study conducted with surveys among students, among institutions, among other panel members on how things are going, how this is turning out to be. And the feedback was broadly positive. The institutions appreciated it. The other panel members appreciated it. The students appreciated it. Of course, there were some issues brought up. What Fernando mentioned, student matters. Early on in the beginning, when student participation and quality assurance was still a somewhat controversial issue, it was thought that students' feedback would be mostly helpful on student issues. But what was then done is to simply offer training on matters that were not considered typical student issues, such as governance issues or hiring policies, these kinds of matters where students would not naturally be involved and knowledgeable about. And this has helped in a lot of ways of making students more comfortable as members of the team and to enhance the impact and usefulness of the feedback to broader areas, not just the so-called student areas.
Thank you so much, Helena. And Martina, can you briefly survey some of the big questions that have been posed?
Very briefly, yes. Indeed, as Fernando mentioned, a good handover process within the student movement is absolutely essential. Without it, we cannot ensure that there is that continuity in the advocacy and the activities that we're doing, both within our projects, but also within our policies and within our research work. But more than that, apart from all of these, is as much as important it is to focus on capacity building internally. And I think the Bologna with Student Eyes is a hard slap on the face for us in the student movement to really realize that the problem is not getting better, the problem is getting worse. Over 3 Bologna with Student Eyes, we've been seeing that there is lower percentages of student representatives on boards, on councils. The role of student representatives is going from having a vote, being over 25% in those boards, to being under 15% of students not voting, perhaps, or just consulted through a survey or a quick consultation. And I think the more that we're not going to be addressing the problem, the worse it's going to get. And we're seeing this case in Europe, we're seeing it in Belarus, and we're seeing it in more countries, that student unions are facing threats toward an external pressure in terms of expulsions for their activism. And not only that, that puts into question, okay, what is the point of me doing this work alongside the fact that I also have to study and get a job and live at the end of the day. So at this point, we really need to show the relevance of student participation. We need to define the relevance of student participation. And by we, I mean as many students as possible. And we're in a defining moment where it's on us to define our narrative, but it's as much as possible, it's as much as important to open up our doors and really raise awareness about the work that we are doing, not only amongst our own bubble, but even beyond that. And this is perhaps reflecting to the question that you asked me about our relevance about the EEA on the EU level. And there are many students out there that are taking part in different activities. I do see a trend of students taking up like summer workshops provided by other student associations. For example, there's ESN, there's AGEN. So there are students that are active through a number of parallel organizations. Question is, how are we going to unite that voice? And I think this is going to be an important question we're going to be discussing within ESU. And I'm happy that the board has approved in our plan of work to enhance our engagement, for example, with our associate memberships, and question what is our inclusive strategies for students. And I hope that that will result in us cementing our legitimacy as the student voice, just as we have that legitimacy within the European higher education area. I'm sure that we can get it within the European education area.
Thank you so much, Martina. I think from this panel alone, there's been some really great perspectives on how important student participation is, but not only how important it is, but how pivotal the role of students actually participating in those spaces is to institutions and to building just and sustainable models of teaching, just and sustainable models of higher education. So actually the onus and Martina answering essentially the question that was posed by Fernando, the role that we play as an entity, ESU, but actually the role that you play as student leaders in your different institutions and spaces, I think is a very, very good question to reflect on, and something that I always reflect on an important line that in NUS UK is kind of like the values in which we organize under, is as long as students are organizing today, there is surely hope for tomorrow. And I quite wholeheartedly believe that. So thank you so much to the speakers that have joined us today. It's been a very rich and fruitful discussion, and to the speakers that have joined us online. And thank you for your patience in bearing with us, because we knew we ran over time a little bit, but please give a final round of applause to all the speakers and participants.